She walked into a house with holes in the roof, mold growing through the walls, and a realtor standing behind her, asking her to sign a liability waiver before she took another step inside. And she bought it anyway. That woman is Jenna Phipps, a Canadian content creator who had spent 5 years building an audience around thrifted fashion and DIY projects, and who had never once picked up a power tool on camera. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why this decision made sense to her, and why the people who'd followed her for years genuinely didn't see it coming. Jenna Phipps started her YouTube channel in 2018, but her first real video didn't land until 2019. It was called Thrift with Me, and she filmed it at a value village in Canada. No production budget, no team. Just Jenna walking through thrift store racks, picking up pieces other people had passed over, and talking about what she saw in them. The video did well enough to tell her she was onto something. She kept going. More thrift hauls, DIY clothing projects, room makeovers built entirely from secondhand finds. She wasn't the loudest voice in that space, but she was consistent, and more than that, she was specific. She didn't just thrift for aesthetics, she understood construction. She could look at a piece of fabric and see what it wanted to become. That skill came from somewhere. Before she was a YouTuber, Jenna worked as a professional visual and graphic designer. It was a creative job on paper. In practice, it left her feeling constrained. She said it plainly in an interview at the time. She wasn't always excited about making things for a client who could tell her what to do, so she left. She started making whatever she wanted, publishing it to YouTube, and building an audience around her own taste rather than someone else's brief. That willingness to trust her own instincts over someone else's approval, to bet on herself when the safer option existed, is the thread that runs through everything that came after it. By 2021, the channel was generating enough momentum that she made another decision that surprised people. For her wedding to Tim Delcourt that July, she didn't buy a dress, she made one. From thrifted fabrics, she curated herself, she designed and sewed her own wedding gown. It was pure Jenna, resourceful, skilled, and completely her own vision. But here's the part that changes everything about what you just heard. Within 2 years of that wedding, everything had changed. In February 2023, Jenna announced publicly that she and Tim had separated. She didn't give a detailed breakdown of what happened. She didn't owe her audience one. But the separation was real, and it was significant. She was in her mid-20s, with a channel built around her identity and her life, and a major piece of that life had shifted. What happened next in her personal life was quiet. She moved forward. She started seeing Nick Volkov, a tech project manager based in British Columbia. They were a new couple, together for roughly a year, when they started talking about what came next. The rental they were living in was 700 square feet. It wasn't enough. They wanted to own something. They were open to a fixer-upper. Because Nick had some building experience, and Jenna, well, Jenna was someone who had always built things by hand. In October 2023, Nick found a listing. The property was in Horseshoe Bay, a neighborhood perched on the water in West Vancouver. The listing showed only exterior photos. It described the house as a teardown. The asking price was significantly below comparable properties in the surrounding area. For West Vancouver, one of the most expensive housing markets in Canada, it was the kind of price that made experienced buyers suspicious and first-timers curious. Nick showed it to Jenna. She wanted to go see it immediately. When we finally got to see the house in person, she later said, we saw it was a lot worse. There was a reason the listing had shown only the outside, and that's when the decision was made, the one nobody around her saw coming. The house was built in 1961. A family had built it and lived in it for decades. In later years, it had been owned by a son, an architect by profession, who had lived there until he passed away. After his death, ownership transferred to his sister, who lived several hours away. She visited occasionally to take things out, but nobody lived there. And for 4 years before Jenna and Nick arrived, the house had sat completely empty. 4 years of no one checking the roof, 4 years of moisture seeping through gaps, 4 years of mold growing quietly in the walls. The couple's realtor had them sign a waiver before they stepped inside. Not standard language, an actual acknowledgement that the property's condition made entry a risk. They signed it and went in anyway. What they found was a 2,757 square foot home that had once been something remarkable. It sat on rocky bluffs overlooking Howe Sound. On a clear day, the view over the water was the kind of thing people spend their entire lives trying to afford. Inside, the original furnishings were still there. A record player was wired into speakers built into the walls throughout the house, so whoever lived there could play music in every room at once. Old photographs showed what the place had looked like at its best. The bones were visible underneath everything that had gone wrong with it. Jenna fell in love with it. They made an offer of $2.1 million, roughly $1.5215 million Westie at the time. The seller agreed. For West Vancouver, where the median list price was running around $1.578 million Westie in early 2024, they had found something the market had undervalued. Nick put it simply, they bought the worst thing in a great neighborhood. But no bank would give them a mortgage. The property's condition made it unfinanceable through traditional channels. They had to take a private 2-year loan instead, splitting the 20% down payment evenly between them. The arrangement meant the clock was running from the moment they closed. Renovate fast enough to refinance, or face what came after. They closed in January 2024. What happened next is the reason this story spread across the internet. On January 31, 2024, one day after closing, Jenna posted the first video. Her audience at that point had been built almost entirely on fashion and thrifting content. She had hundreds of thousands of subscribers who followed her for hauls, DIY clothing tutorials, room makeovers done on a budget. They knew her aesthetic, they knew her voice, they knew the kind of video she made. None of them knew she was about to start tearing apart a century-old house on a cliff in West Vancouver. The first video walked through what they'd found: the holes in the roof, the moisture damage, the mold running through the ceilings and walls, the beauty underneath all of it, the ocean view, the mid-century bones, the record player still wired into the walls. Jenna didn't frame it as a lifestyle upgrade or a renovation channel launch. She talked about it the same way she always talked about a thrift store find. She saw something in it that other people had walked past, and she wanted to find out what it could become. The audience responded. Not just her existing audience, new people found the series. Within weeks, the renovation videos were drawing numbers that matched or exceeded her fashion content. She kept her arrangement with Nick transparent from the start. He would pay down the private loan. She would fund all the renovation expenses herself. The channel would document every step. What neither of them had publicly calculated yet was how expensive those steps were going to get. The early weeks were manageable. They cleared out furniture, stripped drywall, pulled up hardwood flooring, landscape work, things that didn't touch the structure, things that gave them progress without requiring permits. Most people who know this story stop here, but the real story starts right now. In February 2024, the couple applied for their construction permit with the District of West Vancouver. Then they waited. March came. They kept doing what they could without touching the structure. April came. Still no permit. They were going back and forth with the city, asking what they were allowed to do, getting no clear answers. Jenna said later they were never told what was permitted and what wasn't. The rules weren't clear. So they worked within what they understood to be safe boundaries and hoped the permit would come through. On May 17, 2024, 3 months after they applied, the district issued a stop work order. Jenna told her audience directly. She called it severe bad news, the worst news to date. The stop work order didn't just pause the renovation, it put the entire timeline at risk. They had a private 2-year loan. That loan existed on the assumption that they would be able to renovate the house, refinance it, and transition to a traditional mortgage. A stop work order put every part of that plan in jeopardy. 6 days later, the district issued an emergency permit for a partial scope of work, specifically the removal of part of the roof. The permit had been granted based on a structural engineer's assessment of the roof's condition. The emergency nature of the approval said something about how far gone that roof actually was. Jenna and Nick got to work. In the video, Jenna looked at Nick and asked, "How do you take off a roof?" Nick, the tech project manager, said he didn't know. They figured it out anyway. At this point in the story, most people walked away. What she did instead is the part nobody talks about. Let's put the financial reality of this into plain terms, because it's the part of the story that doesn't get enough attention. Jenna and Nick entered this project with a private loan at $1 million Canadian dollars. No traditional bank would touch it. The private loan came with a 2-year window. To get out from under it, the house needed to be in a condition that a conventional lender would accept as collateral, which meant the renovation had to cross certain structural and habitability thresholds within that 2-year window. By June 2025, roughly 18 months into the project, they had spent over $250,000 Canadian dollars on renovations. That number was reported at the time they had brought the house to a point where it finally felt, as Jenna put it, like a real home. The roof had been rebuilt. The windows had gone in. The frame of the house had been opened up and put back together. All of this was done by 2 people who, when they started, didn't know how to remove a roof. What makes this remarkable isn't that they spent the money. It's that Jenna chose to fund the renovation costs entirely herself, out of income she generates as a content creator. The channel that had once documented thrift store trips was now the engine financing a structural rebuild on the coast of British Columbia. Here is a figure worth sitting with. By 2026, Jenna's combined audience across YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok had grown to over 5.4 million followers. Her YouTube channel alone had passed 200 million total views. She launched a second channel, More Jenna Phipps, dedicated to additional renovation content that didn't fit the main channel's format. The pivot didn't shrink her audience, it multiplied it. And if you think that was surprising, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. Here's a question worth asking. Why did this work? There are dozens of renovation channels on YouTube. Home transformation content is its own established genre, with its own formulas, its own stars, its own expectations. Jenna Phipps didn't enter that genre the way most creators would. With a polished premise, a clear niche, a channel trailer explaining what this show was going to be. She entered it as a fashion YouTuber who had just done something her audience couldn't quite process. That gap between who the audience expected her to be and what she was actually doing is where the engagement came from. People watched not because they knew what a Jenna Phipps renovation video was supposed to look like, but because nobody did. The questions drove the views. Can she actually do this? What happens when the city shuts them down? What happens when the money runs out? What does this house look like when it's done? There's also a less discussed element to what she brought to this project that wasn't common in the renovation space. She was a woman doing structural work on camera in a genre dominated by men with pre-existing trade backgrounds. Nick had some experience, but Jenna had none, and she was the one in front of the lens, asking out loud the questions that most first-time builders are too embarrassed to ask. How do you take off a roof? How do you rebuild a frame? What does a stop work order actually mean? And what do you do when you get one? That transparency, the willingness to not know and to say so, was exactly the format she had always used in fashion content. She had never pretended to be an expert thrifter. She'd just been someone who went to thrift stores and showed people what she found. The renovation series ran on the same honesty at a much higher stakes level. She never talked about this publicly as a calculated strategy. It was just how she worked. As of 2026, the house is not finished. It's close. Jenna has described the finishing stages coming together. Flooring, kitchen, bathrooms, bedrooms, with the kind of detail that tells you she knows every corner of the structure by now. The 21-month mark brought a TikTok update that she described as a moment she'd been waiting for since the beginning. She was starting to see what the house was going to become. She has said, publicly and more than once, that she will not sell it, not for any price, not now, not soon. She bought the worst thing in a great neighborhood because she saw what it could be, and she intends to live in it when the work is done. Her channel bio, the thing pinned at the top of her YouTube page, reflects where she is right now. Currently fixing my abandoned home, not fashion creator, not DIY influencer, not home renovation expert. Currently fixing my abandoned home, present tense, still going, still documenting. She's also hiring. Her website listed a job opening for a video editor to help manage the weekly upload schedule, someone who can learn her style and eventually take on shorts, reels, and TikToks alongside the main channel content. The operation has grown to the point where one person can't maintain the output alone. That's not a problem most people expect to have when they buy a house they couldn't get a mortgage on. Here's what the comments kept asking, and here's the answer they never got, until now. The decision that shocked her audience, buying a dilapidated mid-century house on a West Vancouver cliff with a private loan and no construction experience, wasn't actually a departure from who she was. It was the most Jenna Phipps thing she had ever done. She had always found things other people had given up on. She had always trusted what she saw in them over what other people told her they were worth. She had walked away from a career that constrained her to make exactly what she wanted. She had sewed her own wedding dress rather than buy one. The house was just the largest version of something she had always done. What Jenna Phipps built wasn't just a house. It was the same argument she's been making since 2019, that the value in something is rarely what it appears to be from the outside, and that the people willing to do the work most others won't are usually the ones who end up with something worth keeping. The renovation is still ongoing. The second channel is still uploading. The audience is still watching, and it's larger than it has ever been. Whatever the house looks like when she's finally done with it, the version of Jenna Phipps who comes out the other side of this project is not the same creator who walked into a thrift store in 2019 and pointed a camera at a Value Village rack. She learned to build a house, on camera, without knowing how. While hundreds of thousands of people watched, do you think Jenna made the right call walking away from her fashion content to bet everything on a house she couldn't get a bank to finance? Or was that too big a risk for a content creator at her level? Let us know below.